This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history. Episode 3: An Everlasting Name. The faces haunted her. Godiva stared out the window, her eyes fixed on the rows of little homes stretching on into the distance, and the smoke curling up into the sky. She thought of the children in the streets, whose malnourished bodies continually grew thinner under their filthy clothing every time she saw them. The hunger in their eyes was an image she couldn't get out of her mind. She finally tore her eyes away from the window, but looking around at her own grand walls and ornate furniture only made her feel worse. How could she be content with so much when she knew others had so little? She rose to her feet, her long dress falling behind her as she made her way to where she knew she would surely find her husband. Just as she'd expected, she found him near the fireplace in the library, bent over a stack of papers. His 2 dogs sat lazily near his feet. "Leofric," she said, her voice nearly a whisper. His eyes lifted to meet hers before he rose to his feet. "I need to speak with you," Godiva said, stepping into the room. He sighed as he sunk back into his armchair, saying, "I know exactly what you've come to ask, so you can spare me the speech." Godiva ignored the comment, continuing, "You can't turn a blind eye to the suffering of the people, Leofric. Coventry grows poorer by the day." Leofric shifted the papers on his desk. "The taxes are necessary, wife. As an earl, I must maintain some sort of order and financial stability. They can't bear this burden much longer. Even now they starve in the streets," she defended. He dipped the quill into his ink before beginning to scribble something down on parchment. "If I lessened the taxes, I'd be doing myself an injury," he said. She couldn't fathom his indifference. "It would be an injury you could bear," she pointed out. "It is a grievous one for the people." He pinched the bridge of his nose, saying, "I'm growing tired of your pleadings, Godiva. Must you weary me every day with the same request?" "I can't rest until my petition is answered." Leofric's patience was clearly wearing thin. "I gave you an answer." "The wrong answer," she countered. Leofric rose to his feet. "You will grow old asking, wife." Godiva came round to the other side of the fireplace to stand across from him. "By all that is holy, I pray you, lower the taxes, release the people from this servitude. I'll do anything you ask." Leofric shot to his feet. "I am done arguing the point." His face suddenly calmed as a thought seemed to occur to him. He stroked his beard and said with a tilted smile, "You're willing to do anything, are you? Very well. Ride your horse naked through the streets and I will lower the taxes." Godiva stared back at him, stunned. It was such an outlandish bargain, and by the look of triumph in her husband's eyes, it was one he believed her completely incapable of fulfilling. He knew too much of her own modest and pious nature to ever believe her capable of such a thing. "Is there something indeed you won't do to help your beloved people?" he asked with a degree of taunting. She met his challenging gaze. "And should I be willing to do this, will you grant me my request?" Leofric's eyes swam with humor, no doubt feeling that he had won this argument, as he answered flippantly, "I will." I'm here today to clear someone's name. Let me introduce you to Lady Godiva. Strange name, isn't it? You'll probably be more familiar with the Latinized version of her name, Lady Godiva. Maybe you've heard of the chocolate company. But she's actually one of the most famous female figures in British history. But unfortunately, people's knowledge of her is usually limited, and they see her as a strange woman who rode through the streets naked. I'm always sad to hear this, and that people aren't acquainted with the rest of the story. I am actually a literal descendant of Godiva, and I think maybe that's the reason why I feel this special need to redeem her name. So let me tell you the rest of the story. Lady Godiva was an Anglo-Saxon noblewoman who lived during the 11th century. And when I say Anglo-Saxon, it means Old England. She was one of the most wealthy women of her time. Her husband, Leofric, was the Earl of Mercia, and Godiva also owned some land herself, which was really uncommon for women at that time. Some records that we have say that they were very generous toward the church. They even erected a Benedictine monastery in Coventry. Though some people do suspect that Godiva was the main driving force behind a lot of these donations. The details I've just told you are well-documented facts. Now I'm going to tell you what legend says about her. The story that has preserved her name for hundreds of years. Some historians question the story's complete authenticity. However, while details may perhaps stretch over time, most legends seem to be based in some degree of truth. I have a hard time believing that anyone could have entirely invented a story like this, especially when it fits so well with what we know about her generous nature. But the story goes that the people of Coventry were laboring under heavy taxes, and Godiva couldn't bear to see the people suffering. She constantly pleaded with her husband to lower the taxes, which he again and again refused to do. Finally, tired of her requests, he said that if she would ride her horse naked through the streets, he would lower the taxes. Now, I don't think that he ever thought that she would actually go through with it. But he would come to learn that he had underestimated the grit and determination of his wife. An important detail here is that Godiva was a very pious and modest woman, not to mention a noble woman, probably the last person you'd ever expect to see riding naked through the streets. So her husband has good reason to think that she would not do this, but she sends out a proclamation to the people asking them to go inside and close their shutters while she makes her ride. She really wanted to preserve her modesty. Then she lets down her long hair, which covered pretty much everything but her legs, and set off to make the ride in behalf of her people. A single beam of light penetrated the crack of the closed shutters, landing on the scuffed table on the opposite wall. A young widow sat with her children on the hard floor, since they hadn't enough money for any other furniture than the table, which had been given to them by a neighbor. "Why can't I go outside, Mother?" her little son asked, grime caked on his face. "Because Our Lady will be riding through the streets any time now and we must not see her," she explained. The boy's brow furrowed, and he looked as though he still didn't understand. "Is that why we need to keep our shutters closed and stay away from the window?" he further pressed. She put her arm around him, and he nestled into her side. "She's doing something for us," she said, "so we can have a better life." "So we can have more food to eat?" the little girl to her right asked, looking up at her with innocent eyes that were somewhat sunken from a bout of illness she'd been fighting. "Yes, dear," her mother answered. As she spoke the words, they heard the plodding sound of horses' hooves begin to echo down the silent streets. No one saw what was happening. Instead, they were all quietly listening and waiting for the deed to be done. The mother's eyes welled with tears. One slipped from her eye down onto her cheek. Her daughter stared up at her with concern. "Are you upset, Mother?" Her mother laughed, swiping the tear away. "No, my darling, I'm not upset. I'm so very happy." "Then why are you crying?" her son asked. "Because no one of the upper class ever did so much for us," she replied, looking at those young faces she loved so dearly. "Yes," she concluded, "this is a day that will never be forgotten." Roger of Wendover, who wrote the first actual account of Godiva's ride, described it this way. "Then the Countess Godiva, beloved of God, ascended her horse naked, loosing her long hair which clothed her entire body, except her snow-white legs, and having performed the journey, seen by none, returned with joy to her husband, who, regarding it as a miracle, thereupon granted Coventry a charter confirming it with his seal." So Leofric does lower the taxes, and I like the way that Roger of Wendover describes Lady Godiva as beloved of God. Godiva actually translates to gift of God. That's the meaning of her name. When you stop to actually consider the idea of a countess, a woman of rank and birth undergoing something so completely humiliating and exposing for a people whom others of her station would have deemed beneath their even notice, is extraordinary. And she was able to complete her ride without being seen. The people honored her request because of their love and their respect for her, all except one. In the 1600s, there was a character added to this story. Now, let's keep in mind that the original account was written in 1236, so this is hundreds of years later, so it's most likely not the most accurate part of the story. If there's any part of the story you should doubt, it's probably this. But I feel that there is a lesson that we can pull from this, so I decided to include it. They say that there was one person in Coventry that did try to steal a glance at Godiva. His name was Tom, thus giving birth to the term Peeping Tom. The story goes that when he tried to look, he was struck blind, and other accounts say that he was struck dead, but either way, he wasn't able to follow through on his misdeed. Tom became the villain of this legend. Whether or not he actually existed, his name would also go down in history, but for an entirely different reason than Godiva. He tried to defile something that was sacred and see something that he shouldn't. But couldn't that also describe our world today? It seems like more and more the media is drifting away from traditional values, the wholesome, the uplifting, the pure, and instead focusing on the sensual and the obscene. This may be why Godiva's story is not presented the way it should be, as a story about modesty, not immorality, a story about selflessness, not self-indulgence. There have been so many movies made about heroes, upright defenders of what is good in the world. I really think the reason for that is because we all long for a hero, someone who embodies these virtuous characteristics, someone willing to go to battle for us, to release us from the burdens that we can't release ourselves from, the way Godiva did for her people. I believe this really resonates because it has some parallels to a story deeply personal and incredibly important to the human family. We needed someone to come and champion for us, to make a sacrifice that would free us from our burdens. And in the meridian of time, he did come, to suffer greater humiliation than anyone will ever understand and greater pain than we can comprehend. Selflessness is a godly attribute, and where you see service and giving of oneself, you will find God. Alfred Tennyson, who was a very famous poet, wrote a poem about Godiva after a trip that he took to Coventry. He ended with this penetrating paragraph. Then she rode back, clothed on with chastity, and one low churl, compact of thankless earth. Churl basically means scoundrel, so we know that he's probably talking about Tom here. The fatal byword of all years to come. There's that Peeping Tom reference. Boring a little auger hole in fear, peeped, but his eyes, before they had their will, were shriveled into darkness in his head and dropped before him. So the powers who wait on noble deeds, I'm guessing this is referring to God, cancelled a sense misused, and she that knew not passed, and all at once, with 12 great shocks of sound, the shameless noon was clashed and hammered from 100 towers, one after one, but even then she'd gained her bower, or accomplished her deed. Whence reissuing, robed and crowned to meet her lord, she took the tax away, and built herself an everlasting name. I once went walking through a cemetery. Now call me strange, but I've always been intrigued by gravestones. Not for any morbid reason, I just think that they are a reflection of someone's life. It reminds me how temporary life is and how crucial it is to treasure every moment that we're given. But as I walked through this cemetery, I saw an especially large gravestone, and on it were carved the words, "The memory of the just liveth forever." That has been burned into my mind. What will people remember us for? What will people look back and say that we did? Are our actions something that we hope people will remember, or something that we wish people would forget? Tennyson was right when he said that Godiva's name was an everlasting one. I hope this episode has helped you to see that it was also one that was worthy of respect. Someday our names will be carved into stone, something that will last for a really long time. But I hope that our memory lasts even longer. The most amazing stories are the ones that took place hundreds of years ago, and yet they still ignite our faith.